The space station called Meridian Point floated in the darkness between stars. It was a massive structure, built by many different alien species working together. Tonight, it hosted something special. Leaders from across the galaxy had come here for a peace summit. Earth had only been part of the galactic community for 5 years, and this was a big moment for humanity. Captain Jake Morrison stood near the large observation window, watching distant stars sparkle in the void. He wore his dress uniform, dark blue, with several medals pinned to his chest. Each medal told a story of battles fought before humans met aliens, back when Earth's biggest problems were its own wars. Jake was 42 years old, with short brown hair starting to gray at the temples. His face showed the kind of calm that came from years of making hard decisions. He was here as Earth's representative, sent to shake hands and make friends with species humanity had only dreamed about a decade ago. Jake wasn't a politician by nature. He was a soldier who learned diplomacy because his planet needed him to. He preferred clear answers and honest talk, but he knew how to play the diplomatic game when necessary. The reception hall buzzed with activity. Aliens of every shape and size mingled together. Some walked on 2 legs like humans. Others floated or crawled. The air filled with sounds from 100 different languages, though translation devices made it possible for everyone to understand each other. Servers carried trays of food that ranged from familiar to completely strange. Jake had just finished talking with Ambassador Lyra, a kind representative from a species called the Shendari. She had soft blue skin and large, gentle eyes. They had been discussing trade agreements when the mood in the room suddenly changed. Voices grew quieter. People turned to look toward the main entrance. Prince Kael'thas of the Velkari Empire had arrived. The Velkari were one of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy. Their empire controlled 40 star systems and hundreds of worlds. They were powerful, wealthy, and everyone knew it. Prince Kael'thas was the emperor's youngest son, only 17 years old by human counting. He looked almost human, except his skin had a slight golden tint, and his eyes were completely silver with no visible pupils. The young prince wore elaborate robes that probably cost more than a small spaceship. Jewels decorated his clothing, and a thin crown of some silvery metal rested on his dark hair. 6 attendants followed him, along with guards in impressive armor. Everyone in the room either bowed or nodded respectfully as he passed. The prince barely acknowledged them. Jake watched but didn't bow. Humans didn't bow to foreign royalty. A polite nod was enough. This was something Earth's diplomats had made clear from the start. Humans respected other cultures, but they kept their own customs too. Prince Kael'thas made his way around the room, accepting greetings like they were his natural right. His eyes were bored, as if this entire event was beneath him. Then, his silver gaze landed on Jake Morrison. The prince changed direction and walked toward him, his attendants hurrying to keep up. "You are the human representative," Kael'thas said. It wasn't a question. His voice was young but carried the tone of someone used to being obeyed. "Captain Jake Morrison, representing Earth," Jake replied with a polite nod. "Welcome to the summit, Your Highness." The prince's eyes looked Jake up and down, studying his uniform and medals with obvious amusement. A military man. How appropriate. "I understand. Humans are quite proud of their warrior history. We've had our share of conflicts," Jake said carefully. "We've learned from them." "Learned?" Kael'thas laughed, a sharp sound that made nearby delegates turn to watch. "Yes. I suppose even primitive species learn eventually. Tell me, Captain, how long has your species been traveling between stars? 5 years? 6? 5 years since first contact," Jake confirmed, keeping his voice level. "We've been preparing for much longer." 5 years, the prince repeated, loud enough for others to hear. "The Velkari Empire has been exploring the galaxy for 20,000 years. We had cities among the stars when your ancestors were still living in caves, painting on walls." Jake felt tension building but maintained his diplomatic face. "Every species starts somewhere. Your Highness, we're grateful to learn from older civilizations." "Grateful? Yes, you should be grateful." Kael'thas stepped closer, invading Jake's personal space in a way that felt deliberate. Your technology is borrowed. Your ships are based on designs we shared. Your weapons are crude copies of tools we perfected millennia ago. Even your presence here is only because we allowed it. Other delegates were definitely watching now. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed curious about how the human would respond. Ambassador Lyra looked worried. Jake took a slow breath. We appreciate the technology sharing programs. That's what this council is about. Working together. Working together, Kael'thas mocked. Is that what you call it when the primitive species tries to sit at the adult table? He turned to his attendants, who laughed dutifully. Look at these medals. Tell me, Captain, what great victories do they represent? Defeating other humans? Fighting over your single small planet? They represent service and sacrifice, Jake said quietly. Sacrifice, the prince sneered. How noble. Tell me about your wars, human. Tell me about how your people killed each other over invisible lines on the ground, over ancient books and old grudges. Such advanced thinking. Such wisdom. Jake's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. This was a test, he realized. The prince was pushing, seeing how far he could go. I've studied your history, Kael'thas continued. It's quite entertaining. Wars over religion, over skin color, over pieces of land. You nearly destroyed your own planet multiple times, and now you want us to take you seriously? To treat you as equals? He laughed again. You're like children playing with toys you don't understand, pretending to be grown-ups. Jake felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd faced enemy fire, made life and death decisions, and buried friends. He'd represented his planet with dignity even when others looked down on humanity. But this wasn't diplomacy. This was cruelty for entertainment. Your species' greatest achievement, Kael'thas said, his voice dripping with contempt, is that you managed to stop killing each other long enough to answer when we called. And you're proud of this? You celebrate your unity like it's something special? It's not courage, Captain. It's just the desperate thrashing of a species too stupid to know they're irrelevant. The room had gone completely silent. Jake Morrison looked at Prince Kael'thas. He looked at the smug expression on the young alien's face. The expectation of either anger or submission. He thought about all the things he could say. He could defend humanity's achievements. He could point out that Earth had gone from first flight to space travel in less than a century. He could mention that humans had survived and grown stronger through every challenge. But he didn't say any of those things. Jake simply looked at the prince for a long, quiet moment. Then, without a single word, he turned around and walked away. His footsteps echoed in the silent reception hall. He didn't look back. He didn't ask permission to leave. He just walked toward the exit with his shoulders straight and his head high. Behind him, shocked silence filled the room. No one walked away from a Velkhari prince. No one turned their back on royalty. It simply wasn't done. But Jake Morrison did it anyway. He walked through the doors and disappeared into the corridor, leaving Prince Kael'thas standing in the middle of the reception hall, his mouth slightly open in surprise. For the first time in his life, at a complete loss for words. News traveled fast in the galaxy, especially when it involved royal families and diplomatic incidents. By the next morning, every major news network across 100 worlds was showing the same video footage. The clip showed Prince Kael'thas insulting Captain Jake Morrison, and then the moment that shocked everyone. The human simply turned and walked away without saying a word. On Earth, the video went viral within hours. People watched it again and again. They shared it with friends and family. They argued about it in coffee shops and offices. But one thing was clear. Almost everyone supported what Jake did. Message boards filled with comments. He did the right thing. Nobody should tolerate that kind of disrespect. Good for him. In cities around Earth, crowds began gathering outside Velkhari trade centers. The protests were peaceful but firm. People carried signs with simple messages. Respect goes both ways. Earth stands with Morrison. Dignity over diplomacy. The protesters didn't want war. They just wanted their government to know that humans wouldn't accept being treated like children by anyone, no matter how powerful. Back on Meridian Point, the diplomatic summit had turned into chaos. The scheduled meetings were forgotten. Everyone was talking about the incident. Ambassador Chen, Earth's senior diplomat at the station, spent the entire morning in emergency meetings. She was a skilled negotiator, gray-haired and experienced, but even she looked stressed. The Valkyrie delegation demanded a formal apology. Lord Drental, the prince's chief advisor, was a tall alien with sharp features and an even sharper voice. He stood in the council chamber and spoke with barely controlled anger. "This insult cannot stand," Drental declared. Captain Morrison showed complete disrespect to a crown prince of the Valkyrie Empire. He turned his back on royalty. He walked away without permission. This violates every standard of diplomatic protocol. Earth must apologize formally and punish this officer, or there will be consequences. Ambassador Chen stood to respond. Captain Morrison was subjected to personal insults and attacks on his species. He chose not to engage in a confrontation. He removed himself from a hostile situation peacefully. "This is not a crime under any law we recognize." "He insulted the prince," Drental insisted. "With respect," Chen said carefully. "The prince insulted first." Captain Morrison simply chose not to continue the conversation. The council chamber erupted in whispered conversations. Other delegates shared looks. Some seemed uncomfortable, others thoughtful. That afternoon, Ambassador Chen found Jake in his temporary quarters on the station. He was packing his belongings, preparing for transfer back to his ship. He looked calm, but Chen knew him well enough to see the tension in his shoulders. "They want you to apologize," she said without preamble. "I know," Jake replied, folding a uniform into his bag. "Will you?" Jake stopped and looked at her. "Would you?" Chen sat down heavily in a chair. "The Valkyrie Empire is powerful, Jake. They control resources we need. They have military strength that could threaten our colonies. If this escalates, then it escalates," Jake said quietly. "I'm sorry, Ambassador. I know this makes your job harder. But I won't apologize for refusing to be insulted. I won't tell that boy that he had the right to treat me that way. He's a prince. He's a bully with a crown," Jake corrected. "And I'm a human being. That should be enough," Chen sighed. She couldn't really argue with him, and part of her didn't want to. President Grant has called an emergency cabinet meeting. They're deciding how to respond to the Valkyrie demands. "What do you think they'll do?" "I don't know," Chen admitted. "The pressure is enormous, but the public support for you is overwhelming. No politician wants to be the one who threw you to the wolves." She paused. "Or to the aliens, as the case may be." Jake managed a small smile at that. Later that day, Jake was quietly transferred to his ship, the Earth vessel Valiant. The official reason was routine rotation of personnel. Everyone knew the real reason. They were getting him off the station before things got worse. The Valiant was a good ship. Not the biggest in Earth's fleet, but solid and reliable. The crew welcomed Jake back with enthusiasm. They'd all seen the video. Every single person on board supported what he'd done. His second-in-command, Commander Amy Parker, greeted him in the docking bay with a grin. "Captain on deck," she called out, and the assembled crew snapped to attention. "At ease," Jake said, but he couldn't help smiling at their obvious solidarity. Amy walked with him toward the bridge. "You're famous, sir. Everyone in the fleet is talking about you. Half of Earth is talking about you." "Not the kind of famous I wanted to be," Jake muttered. "Maybe not. But it's the kind of famous that matters. You showed the galaxy that humans don't fold just because someone with power tells us to." On the bridge, the crew worked with their usual efficiency. But Jake noticed the subtle signs of respect. The way people met his eyes and nodded. The way they stood a little straighter. He'd become a symbol of something, though he'd never intended to be. Meanwhile, in a luxury suite on the opposite side of the station, Prince Kael'thas was having a very different experience. He sat alone, which was unusual for him. His attendants waited in the outer room. Dismissed with an angry wave. For the first time he could remember, the prince wanted to be by himself. He kept replaying the moment in his mind. The way Morrison had looked at him. Not with fear or anger, but with something else. Something like disappointment, or maybe pity. Then the turn, the walk, the absolute silence. It haunted him in a way nothing else ever had. People had challenged Kael'thas before, of course. They'd argued with him, or expressed disagreement. But they always stayed engaged. They fought back with words, or they submitted and apologized. The human had done neither. He'd simply decided that the prince wasn't worth his time or energy. It was the most insulting thing anyone had ever done to him, and Kael'thas couldn't even explain why. There was no formal insult to point to. No specific action that violated any rule. Morrison had just left. But somehow that silence, that complete dismissal, hurt worse than any verbal counterattack could have. His advisor, Lord Drental, had assured him that Earth would apologize within days. The Velkhari Empire always got what it demanded. Always. Their power made lesser species comply. But watching the news reports, seeing the protests on Earth, Kael'thas wasn't so sure. Far across the galaxy on the Velkhari homeworld, Emperor Zarntok sat on his throne and watched the same reports. His youngest son had created an incident, which was embarrassing but not unprecedented. Royal children sometimes behaved badly. What concerned the emperor was Earth's response, or rather, their lack of response. They weren't apologizing. They weren't begging for forgiveness. They weren't even really arguing about it. They were just standing firm, like they had every right to their dignity, regardless of what the Velkhari Empire thought. The emperor had ruled for 300 years. He'd seen many species join the galactic community. Most were eager to please, desperate for acceptance and protection. Humans were different. They wanted partnership, not patronage. They demanded respect rather than requesting it. It made them dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with weapons or military strength. On Earth itself, President Lisa Grant addressed the Planetary Council. She was a strong leader, elected because people trusted her judgment in humanity's first decade as a spacefaring civilization. The Velkhari Empire has issued an ultimatum, she told the assembled representatives. They want us to hand over Captain Morrison for judgment in their courts. They want a formal apology from Earth as a whole. They want us to acknowledge that their prince had every right to speak to our people however he chooses. And our response? Someone asked. President Grant's expression hardened. Our response is, no. We don't hand over our citizens to foreign powers for the crime of having self-respect. We don't apologize for refusing to be bullied. And we certainly don't acknowledge that anyone has the right to abuse our people. They'll threaten us, another representative warned. Maybe worse than threats. Let them, Grant said firmly. Humanity didn't survive everything we've survived by bowing every time someone powerful got angry. We have principles. Sometimes principles cost something, but they're worth the price. The vote was overwhelming. Earth would stand by Jake Morrison. They would stand by the simple idea that respect must be mutual, regardless of who had the most ships or the oldest civilization. The message went out across all official channels. Earth's position was clear and firm, and in his suite on Meridian Point, Prince Kael'thas received that message and realized that the human who walked away had started something that no one could easily stop. For the first time in his privileged life, the young prince felt the weight of real consequences for his actions. He also felt something else, though he didn't have a name for it yet. It was the uncomfortable feeling of knowing that maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong. 3 weeks passed, and the situation got worse instead of better. The Velkhari Empire wasn't used to being told no. Their response was predictable and heavy-handed. They announced economic sanctions against Earth. Trade agreements were frozen. Technology sharing programs were suspended. Velkhari ships began moving toward human space, conducting what they called military exercises. On the Valiant, Jake Morrison stood on the bridge watching sensor displays. 40 Velkhari warships had positioned themselves just outside the border of human-controlled space. They weren't attacking. Not yet. But the message was clear. They were showing their strength, reminding Earth of the consequences of defiance. Commander Amy Parker stood beside him, studying the same displays. "They're trying to scare us," she said quietly. "I know," Jake replied. He felt the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. All of this, the fleet movements and the sanctions, had started because he walked away from an insulting teenager. Part of him wondered if he should have just stayed quiet and endured it. But a larger part of him knew that giving in would have been worse. "The crew wants you to know they support you, Captain," Amy said. "Every single person on this ship. Every ship in the fleet. Actually, messages have been coming in all day." Jake nodded, grateful but troubled. "I appreciate that. But support doesn't stop those warships if they decide to attack." Down on Earth, the situation was tense but determined. President Grant held daily briefings with military commanders and diplomatic advisors. The discussions were always the same. Could Earth defend itself against the Valkyrie Empire? Technically, maybe. For a little while. Would it be a war they could win? Absolutely not. General Pete Hayes, Earth's top military commander, laid out the situation bluntly in one meeting. "We have good ships and well-trained people, but the Valkyrie have been building their military for thousands of years. They have weapon systems we've barely begun to understand. They have resources we can't match. In a straight fight, we lose. So we should surrender?" President Grant asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "I didn't say that," Hayes replied firmly. "I'm just being honest about what we're facing. But there's something else to consider. We're not alone. Other species are watching this. How we respond matters beyond just this one incident." He was right. Across the galaxy, smaller civilizations watched Earth's situation with intense interest. For centuries, many of them had endured similar treatment from the Valkyrie Empire. They'd been insulted, dismissed, treated as lesser beings. But they'd always apologized, always submitted, because the alternative seemed too dangerous. Now humans were showing another path. It was risky, maybe even reckless, but it was honest. Ambassador Lyra of the Shendari had quietly reached out to Ambassador Chen with a message. Her people supported Earth's stance, even if they couldn't say so publicly. Several other species sent similar private messages. They couldn't help militarily, but they were watching and hoping. On the Valkyrie homeworld, Prince Kael'thas was going through his own struggle. His father had ordered him to stay on the capital planet, away from the potential conflict zone. The young prince was supposed to be learning from all this, but the lessons weren't what his father intended. Kael'thas had started studying human culture obsessively. He read their history, their philosophy, their literature. He watched documentaries about Earth's wars and peace movements. He learned about concepts that the Valkyrie didn't emphasize, things like individual dignity, civil rights, and the idea that every person had inherent worth regardless of their position in society. One night, he found himself reading about an old human named Nelson Mandela, who had been imprisoned for decades, but never gave up his dignity or his principles. He read about peaceful protesters who faced violence rather than surrender their beliefs. He studied the American Civil Rights Movement, where ordinary people stood up to enormous power and won. Not through weapons, but through moral courage. It confused him. The Valkyrie were taught that power determined worth. The strong ruled, the weak obeyed. This was natural law. But humans seemed to believe something different. They believed in equality, in mutual respect, in the idea that might doesn't make right. Prince Kael'thas thought about Jake Morrison walking away. At the time, he'd seen it as cowardice, or perhaps stupidity. Now he understood it differently. The human hadn't walked away because he was weak. He'd walked away because he was strong enough not to need the prince's approval or acceptance. He'd walked away because he valued his own dignity more than he valued the prince's opinion. It was a kind of strength that Kael'thas had never encountered before, and he didn't know what to do with it. His father, Emperor Zarntok, noticed the change in his son. The young prince was quieter, more thoughtful, less certain of himself. The emperor assumed it was wounded pride and hoped the military exercises would restore his son's confidence. He'd ordered the fleet to intimidate Earth into submission, expecting a quick surrender. But the surrender didn't come. Days turned into weeks, and Earth stood firm. Human ships took defensive positions. They prepared for conflict they probably couldn't win. But they didn't back down. On the Valiant, Jake received thousands of messages from people across Earth and human colonies. Most were supportive. Some shared their own stories of standing up to bullies and authorities. A few were from veterans who understood the weight of choosing principle over safety. One message stood out. It came from a young girl, maybe 10 years old, from a colony on Mars. She wrote in simple words that her teacher had shown the class, the video of Jake walking away. The teacher had explained that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to participate in something wrong, even when powerful people want you to. The girl wanted to thank him for showing her what courage looked like. Jake read that message 3 times. It reminded him why this mattered. It wasn't about him personally. It was about what kind of species humanity wanted to be as they moved out into the galaxy. Did they want to be people who accepted abuse to avoid conflict? Or did they want to be people who stood for something, even when it was hard? The tension built day by day. The Valkyrie fleet conducted aggressive maneuvers. They tested human defensive perimeters, pushing boundaries without quite crossing into open warfare. It was psychological pressure, designed to break Earth's resolve. But something unexpected was happening. The longer Earth held firm, the more other species started to speak up. A delegation of 7 smaller civilizations issued a joint statement supporting Earth's right to dignity and self-determination. They didn't offer military help, but the public support mattered. The galactic news media began asking uncomfortable questions. Why was the mighty Valkyrie Empire so threatened by one human's silent protest? What did it say about the Empire that they needed to mobilize a fleet because someone walked away from an insult? Wasn't that a bit extreme? Emperor Zarntok felt the political pressure mounting. He'd expected a quick victory, a lesson taught to younger species about respecting their betters. Instead, he'd created a situation where his empire looked like bullies picking on a smaller civilization for refusing to grovel. But the emperor was proud and stubborn. He'd made demands. And the Valkyrie Empire always followed through on its demands. To back down now would show weakness. So the fleet stayed in position, and the sanctions remained in place, and everyone waited to see who would blink first. On the bridge of the Valiant, Jake Morrison watched the Valkyrie ships through the viewscreen and wondered if his simple act of walking away would lead to war. He hoped not. He prayed not. But he also knew that some things were worth fighting for, and human dignity was one of them. Commander Amy brought him a cup of coffee, earth-grown and precious this far from home. "Sir, if I may ask a personal question?" "Go ahead," Jake said. "Do you regret it? Walking away, I mean. Knowing what's happened since?" Jake thought about it for a long moment. He thought about the fleet outside, the sanctions, the political crisis. He thought about that young girl's message, about the other species quietly supporting Earth's stand. He thought about what it meant to be human in a galaxy full of older, more powerful civilizations. "No," he said finally. "I don't regret it. Because if we fold every time someone powerful wants us to, we lose something important. We lose ourselves, and that's not worth any amount of safety or comfort." Amy smiled. "Good answer, sir." Across space, Prince Kael'thas made a decision. He'd been reading about humans for weeks, learning about their values and their history. He'd replayed his own words to Jake Morrison and felt genuine shame for the first time in his privileged life. He'd been cruel not because he needed to be, but because he could be, because no one had ever stopped him. The human had stopped him. Not with violence or threats, but with simple dignity and silence. Kael'thas requested an audience with his father, which was granted immediately. What he intended to say would shock the emperor and possibly change everything. The young prince had learned something important from a species his people had dismissed as primitive. He'd learned that true strength wasn't about dominating others. It was about having the courage to admit when you were wrong. The stage was set for a conversation that would determine whether this crisis ended in war or understanding. The Valkyrie fleet moved closer to human space. What had been exercises and posturing became something more serious. The 40 warships took up attack formations. their weapons systems powered up and ready. On Earth, alarms went off in military command centers. This was it. The moment everyone had feared was finally here. President Grant called an emergency session of Earth's Defense Council. Military leaders gathered in the Situation Room, faces grim. General Hayes stood at a holographic display showing the Valkyrie positions. Red dots represented enemy ships. Blue dots showed human defenses. There was a lot more red than blue. "They're preparing for a strike," Hayes said plainly. "Based on their formation, they could begin firing within the hour." "Are our people ready?" Grant asked. "As ready as they can be, Madam President. Every ship is at battle stations. Colonies are on high alert. We've evacuated civilians from the most vulnerable outposts." He paused. "But we all know how this ends. If they attack, we'll fight. And we'll fight well. But we can't win. Then we make them remember the cost," Grant said quietly. "If Earth is going to stand for something, we stand all the way." In space, aboard the Valiant, Jake Morrison received the alert about the Valkyrie fleet movement. His crew moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for battle. Every person on board knew the odds. Every person stayed at their post anyway. Amy Parker checked weapons systems and reported they were ready. "All stations report prepared, Captain. We're as ready as we'll ever be." Undin 17. Undin 17-7. "Take the rebitterdas," reported the Sindas. Jake looked around his bridge at the young men and women working their stations. They were calm, professional, and completely committed. They would follow him into a battle they couldn't win because they believed in what they were fighting for. The weight of that responsibility was almost crushing. "Send a message to the fleet," Jake said. "Tell them humanity stands together. Whatever comes, we face it with dignity." The message went out to every human ship in space. It was simple, but it meant everything. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the right to exist on their own terms, with their own values, respected as equals, rather than tolerated as inferiors. On one of the Valkyrie warships, Prince Kael'thas stood in the command center. His father had finally allowed him to join the fleet, thinking that watching human defiance crumble would complete his son's education. The prince wore ceremonial armor that marked him as royal blood. But inside, he felt nothing like the confident young man who had insulted Jake Morrison weeks ago. The fleet commander, Admiral Vorzan, a battle-hardened warrior with centuries of experience, gave orders to his captains. "Prepare to fire on my command. We will strike their forward positions first, destroy their defensive capability, then demand surrender." "Admiral," Kael'thas said suddenly. His voice carried across the command center. "I wish to speak with the human ship Valiant before we attack." Vorzan turned, surprise evident on his scaled face. "Your Highness, that's not necessary. We have our orders from the Emperor." "I'm not questioning orders," Kael'thas said, standing straighter. "I'm requesting a communication link. Surely we can grant that before beginning battle." The Admiral hesitated. The prince was young, but he was still a prince. Refusing him directly could have consequences. "Very well, Your Highness, but keep it brief." The communication request went through official channels to the Valiant. On the bridge, Jake was surprised to see an incoming call from the Valkyrie flagship, specifically requesting him. He accepted, and Prince Kael'thas's face appeared on the main screen. The young alien looked different than he had at the reception. His expression was serious, almost troubled. There was no sign of the smug arrogance that had filled his face before. "Captain Morrison," Kael'thas said, "I wanted to speak with you before any fighting begins." Jake studied the prince carefully. "I'm listening, Your Highness." There was a long pause. Around the Valiant's bridge, the crew watched in silence. Across the Valkyrie command center, officers and soldiers waited to hear what their prince would say. "Why did you walk away?" Kael'thas asked. The question that had haunted him for weeks finally spoken out loud. "I've replayed that moment thousands of times. I don't understand. You could have argued with me. You could have insulted me back. You could have done many things. But you just left. Why?" Jake thought carefully before answering. This wasn't just a conversation between two individuals anymore. Both fleets were listening. Both civilizations would hear this. His words needed to be honest but also clear. Because your title doesn't obligate me to endure disrespect, Your Highness, Jake said quietly. Power doesn't equal worth. You wanted me to either fight you, which would prove you could provoke me, or submit to you, which would prove you could dominate me. I chose neither. I simply chose not to participate in your game. But I am a prince of the Velkari Empire, Kael'thas said, though his voice lacked the certainty it once held. That should mean something. It does mean something, Jake acknowledged. It means you were born into responsibility and privilege. It means you represent your people and carry their honor. But it doesn't mean you can treat others as lesser beings. Respect isn't something you inherit, Your Highness. It's something you earn. And I didn't earn yours. No, Jake said simply. You didn't. The silence stretched between them. In the Velkari command center, officers shifted uncomfortably. This was not the kind of conversation anyone expected to hear from their prince. I've been studying your people, Kael'thas said. For weeks now. I've read your history, your philosophy. I wanted to understand what kind of species produces someone who would walk away from a prince. Do you know what I learned? Tell me, Jake said. I learned that humans believe every individual has inherent dignity. Not because of their position or power, but simply because they exist. I learned that you fought wars over this idea, that people died to defend this principle. I learned about something you call civil rights. About people who stood up to overwhelming power because they believed they deserved respect. Kael'thas paused, then continued. The Velkari don't think this way. We believe in hierarchy. The strong rule. The weak obey. This has been our way for thousands of years. It built our empire, but watching you walk away, seeing your people stand firm even now, when my empire threatens war, I have to wonder if maybe our way isn't the only way. If maybe it isn't even the best way. Admiral Vorzin looked alarmed. This was not appropriate talk from a prince, especially not broadcast across both fleets. But he hesitated to interrupt royal blood speaking so candidly. Jake Morrison felt something shift in the conversation. This wasn't about diplomacy or politics anymore. This was one person genuinely trying to understand another. Your Highness, Jake said. Every civilization has to choose what kind of society they want to be. The Velkari chose hierarchy and order. Humans chose something messier and more complicated. We chose to believe that a janitor has the same fundamental worth as a president. That a child has the same inherent dignity as an elder. That every person deserves respect, simply because they're a person. Is that what you were defending when you walked away? Kael'thas asked. That inherent dignity? Yes, Jake said. Because if I had stayed and accepted your insults, if I had let you treat me as inferior just because you have more power, then I would have betrayed everything my species believes in. I would have said that human dignity is negotiable, that our values can be discarded when they're inconvenient, and that's something I won't do. Not for safety, not for peace, not for anything. The young prince was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. I was cruel to you at that reception. I said terrible things about your people, about your service, about your achievements. I did it because I could, because no one ever stopped me before, because I thought my position gave me the right. And now? Jake asked. Now I understand that position without character is just empty privilege. I understand that you walking away wasn't weakness. It was strength. The strength to value yourself enough not to need my approval. Kael'thas straightened his shoulders. Captain Morrison, I want to apologize to you and to your people. My behavior was wrong. My words were wrong. I abused my position and used my power to hurt someone who deserved better. I'm sorry. The command centers of both fleets erupted in shocked murmurs. A Velkari prince didn't apologize, especially not to someone from a younger species, especially not publicly like this. Jake Morrison stood a little straighter. I accept your apology, Your Highness. and I appreciate the courage it took to offer it. There's something else, Kael'thas said, glancing at Admiral Vorzan. I'm going to recommend to my father that we withdraw the fleet and lift the sanctions. This conflict began because of my mistake. It shouldn't escalate into war. Humans have done nothing wrong except refuse to be disrespected. And that's not a crime. That's integrity. Admiral Vorzan stepped forward. Your Highness, the Emperor gave orders. Then I will speak with my father, Kael'thas said firmly. I will tell him what I've learned. That forcing submission doesn't create respect. It creates resentment. That true leadership means admitting when you're wrong. That maybe the Velkhari Empire needs to learn from younger species instead of always teaching them. He looked back at Jake. Thank you, Captain Morrison, for teaching me something more valuable than my tutors ever did. You taught me what real strength looks like. The communication ended, leaving both bridges in stunned silence. Jake sat back in his chair, hardly believing what had just happened. Around him, his crew slowly started to smile, then to cheer. They weren't out of danger yet. The prince's words were powerful, but the Emperor still controlled the fleet. But something important had shifted. A bridge had been built between two very different peoples, started by one human's quiet refusal to accept disrespect, and completed by one young alien's courage to admit he was wrong. Prince Kael'thas didn't waste time after his conversation with Jake Morrison. He immediately requested a private communication channel with his father on the Velkhari homeworld. Emperor Zarntok answered quickly, his expression stern on the holographic display. Father, I need to speak with you about the human situation. Kael'thas began. There is nothing to discuss, the Emperor replied coldly. The fleet has orders. Earth will submit or face the consequences. Father, please listen, Kael'thas said, his voice respectful but firm. I was wrong. This entire situation started because I was cruel and disrespectful to their representative. I insulted Captain Morrison without cause. I treated him as inferior simply because I could. The humans aren't defying our empire. They're just defending their dignity. Emperor Zarntok's eyes narrowed. You are letting these humans manipulate you with soft words. This is about power and respect for authority. No, Father. It's about respect, but not the kind we thought. Kael'thas took a breath. I've spent weeks studying human culture. They have a concept of inherent worth. Every person, regardless of position, deserves basic respect. When I denied Captain Morrison that respect, he didn't owe me anything in return. His walking away wasn't an insult to me. It was defense of himself. You are a prince of the Velkhari Empire. And he is a human being with dignity, Kael'thas said. Father, forcing them to apologize won't make them respect us. It will make them resent us. And watching from across the galaxy are dozens of other species who have endured similar treatment from us. If we destroy Earth over this, what message does that send? That might makes right? That we'll wage war on anyone who doesn't grovel? The Emperor was silent for a long moment. He'd ruled for 3 centuries. And in all that time, few had ever questioned the Empire's methods. Certainly not his own son. What do you propose? Zarntok asked finally. I propose we withdraw the fleet. I propose we lift the sanctions. And I propose that I make a public apology to humanity for my behavior. Not because they forced us to, but because it's the right thing to do. The galaxy will see this as weakness. The galaxy will see this as wisdom, Kael'thas countered. They'll see that the Velkhari Empire is strong enough to admit mistakes, that we value justice over pride. And Father, the galaxy is already watching. They see a massive empire threatening a small civilization because one human refused to be insulted. How does that make us look? Emperor Zarntok closed his eyes. His son had grown up considerably in the past few weeks. Perhaps there was wisdom in his words. Perhaps the old ways of domination weren't the only path forward. The Emperor made a decision that surprised even himself. Very well, I will order the fleet to withdraw, but you will make your apology, and you will mean it. And then you will work to repair the damage you've caused. Yes, Father. Thank you. Within hours, the Velkhari fleet began pulling back from human space. The withdrawal was orderly and complete. On Earth, celebrations erupted in the streets. People cheered and cried with relief. They'd stood firm, and it had worked. Humanity had defended its dignity and survived. President Grant addressed the planet with a short message. Today, we proved something important. We proved that principles matter, that dignity is not negotiable, that respect must be mutual, even between the smallest and largest civilizations. We didn't win through weapons or threats. We won by being true to who we are as humans. 2 days later, Prince Kael'thas made his public apology. It was broadcast across the entire galaxy through every major news network. He wore formal robes but no crown. He stood alone, without attendants or guards. "I am Prince Kael'thas of the Velkhari Empire," he began. "I come before you today to apologize to humanity and specifically to Captain Jake Morrison. At a diplomatic reception weeks ago, I behaved shamefully. I used my position to insult and demean a person who deserved better. I mocked his species, dismissed their achievements, and treated him as inferior simply because I had the power to do so." He paused, looking directly at the camera. Captain Morrison responded by walking away without a word. I was angry at first. I thought he was being disrespectful. But I was wrong. He was showing me something I needed to see. He was showing me that dignity cannot be taken away unless you surrender it. That respect isn't something you can demand, only something you can earn. That true strength is knowing your own worth, regardless of what others say. Kael'thas continued. I have spent time studying human culture and philosophy. I've learned about their belief in inherent human worth, about their struggles for civil rights and equality, about their conviction that every person deserves respect simply because they're a person. These are not primitive ideas. These are advanced concepts that my own civilization could learn from. To Captain Morrison, I offer my sincere apology. You handled my cruelty with grace and dignity. You taught me more in one silent moment than I learned in years of royal education. To humanity as a whole, I apologize for my words and for the crisis my actions created. You stood firm in your principles, and the galaxy is better for it. And to all species watching, I say this. The Velkhari Empire is powerful, but power without wisdom is just tyranny. We have much to learn from younger civilizations. Perhaps respect and cooperation will serve us better than domination and fear. I intend to spend my life learning that lesson. When the broadcast ended, responses came from across the galaxy. Smaller species, long oppressed by more powerful civilizations, saw hope in the prince's words. Political commentators called it unprecedented. Some Velkhari traditionalists were outraged, but many others, especially younger members of their society, praised Kael'thas's courage. On Earth, people watched the apology with mixed feelings. Some were satisfied. Others remained skeptical, but most recognized it as genuine. The prince hadn't made excuses or minimized his behavior. He'd owned his mistake completely. A week later, something unexpected happened. Prince Kael'thas requested permission to visit Earth as part of his diplomatic education. He wanted to learn more about human culture firsthand. After some debate, Earth's government approved the visit. They saw it as an opportunity to build bridges. Jake Morrison was asked if he would meet with the prince privately during his visit. He agreed, though he admitted to Amy that he was nervous about it. He seemed sincere, Amy said. The apology felt real. Maybe, Jake said, but actions matter more than words. We'll see. The meeting was arranged in a quiet park in New York City, away from media attention. No official delegation. No guards beyond basic security at a distance. Just two people meeting to talk. Jake arrived first, wearing civilian clothes. He found a bench near a fountain and sat down, watching children play nearby. When Prince Kael'thas arrived, he was also dressed simply, without royal regalia. He looked younger somehow, less sure of himself than he had at the reception. Captain Morrison, Kael'thas said as he approached. Your Highness, Jake replied, standing. They shook hands, a human gesture the prince had learned. They sat on the bench together, an unlikely pair. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Kael'thas broke the silence. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I wasn't sure you would." "Honestly, I wasn't sure I would either," Jake admitted. "But I believe people can change." And your apology seemed genuine. It was. It is. Kael'thas looked at the playing children. "Is this a typical human place? Just a park. People come here to relax, to let their kids play, to enjoy nature. Nothing special. Really. Everything here seems special to me," the prince said quietly. "On my world, public spaces are formal and structured. Children don't play freely like this. Everyone maintains their proper place in the hierarchy." He paused. "It seems lonely, now that I think about it." Jake studied the young alien. "You've learned a lot in a few weeks." "I've been trying, reading everything I can about human history and culture. Do you know what impressed me most? Your civil rights movements. Ordinary people standing up to governments, to social systems, to powerful institutions, demanding to be treated with dignity, and they won, not through violence but through moral courage." "It wasn't easy," Jake said. "And it's not finished. We still struggle with equality and justice, but we keep trying. Because you believe everyone deserves respect." "Yes. Because we believe that, even when it's hard to live up to." Kael'thas turned to look at Jake directly. "When you walked away from me that night, you showed me something I'd never seen before. You showed me that you valued yourself enough not to need my approval. That you had principles that mattered more than avoiding conflict. It was the most powerful thing anyone has ever done to me, and it was completely silent." Jake considered his words carefully. "Your Highness, I think you learned the right lesson. But I want you to understand something. I didn't walk away to teach you anything. I walked away for me, because staying would have meant accepting that I was worth less than you, and I don't believe that. I'm not better than you, but I'm not worse either. We're equal. Different, but equal." "Equal." Kael'thas repeated the word like he was tasting it. "The Velkhari language has a word for that, but we rarely use it. We think in terms of higher and lower, superior and inferior. Maybe that's something your people can work on," Jake suggested gently. They talked for over an hour, about culture and philosophy, about leadership and responsibility, about what it means to grow up and learn that what you were taught isn't always right. When they finally stood to leave, there was a mutual respect between them that hadn't existed before. Prince Kael'thas extended his hand again. "Thank you, Captain Morrison. For the lesson, for this conversation, for giving me a chance to try to make this right." Jake shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for having the courage to change. That's not easy for anyone, prince or not." As Kael'thas turned to leave, Jake called after him. "Your Highness?" The prince turned back. "You asked me once why I walked away. Can I ask you something now? Why did you follow?" Kael'thas smiled, a genuine expression. "Because you showed me a path I'd never seen before. Because your silence was louder than any argument. Because I realized that the Emperor of 1,000 worlds isn't impressive if he rules without wisdom or compassion. You walked away from power, and in doing so, you showed me what real strength looks like. So I followed, hoping I could learn to be stronger too." He left then, walking across the park toward his transport. Jake watched him go, thinking about how strange the galaxy could be. A few weeks ago, this young alien had been an arrogant prince who needed to be taught a lesson. Now he was someone trying to be better, trying to grow. Maybe that was the real HFY story, Jake thought. Not that humans were better than everyone else, but that they could inspire others to be better versions of themselves. That standing firm in your principles could create ripples that changed minds and hearts across the stars. The incident became a landmark moment in galactic history. Scholars studied it. Diplomats referenced it. Young people across dozens of worlds learned about the human who walked away and the prince who learned from it. It became a symbol of how conflicts could end not in war but in understanding. Earth's relationship with the Velkhari Empire improved slowly but steadily. There would be challenges ahead, misunderstandings, and disagreements. But there was also respect, genuine and hard-earned. And somewhere in all of that, Jake Morrison remained himself. Still calm, still principled, still the kind of person who valued dignity over convenience. He didn't think of himself as a hero, he'd just done what felt right at the moment. But sometimes, doing what feels right changes everything. The galaxy learned that day that humans would engage on their own terms, with their own values, seeking partnership rather than dominance or submission. It was a very human solution to a galactic problem. And it changed the conversation about power and respect across the stars. Sometimes the most powerful statement isn't what you say. Sometimes it's what you refuse to tolerate. And sometimes, walking away is the bravest thing you can do.